Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Aesthetics series. This is lecture 2, and the first lecture I tried to kind of give us an itinerary and just basically told us what's important, while also, besides just basic introductory information, which this one will be too, I tried to go over the epistemological assumptions of art and I tried to demonstrate the need for the more fundamental, the lower branches or the lower tiers in the pyramid of the philosophical hierarchy. And so, in doing that, I wanted to try to illustrate the complexity and the vastness in which we're not exactly in a paradox, but it is kind of strange how aesthetics is a much more particular branch of philosophy because it deals with the world of particulars much more so, but it is also an ideal. It is a specific Platonic form or Platonic idea, or going back, I'm sorry, to the Platonic, dialogues, just like truth and goodness. And beauty is strange because it's kind of like not the necessarily the visual, but in some sense the perceptual identity of goodness and truth and other correlating uh, Platonic ideas. It in fact is the one idea that kind of makes all the other ideas visible and is not the same as all of the other ideas, but it correlates to all of them. So, for instance, goodness is not beauty, but goodness is not goodness without beauty. Whereas beauty is not beauty, it would be void if it is in fact void of goodness. I don't know if that makes sense. It's complicated, but I think that kind of demonstrates the complexities that we're dealing with here. And I know these are probably more archaic ideas than what is espoused currently, but it's things we need to understand if we're going to be looking into the historical um, nature of and evidence found in uh, more like Platonic and Aristotelian kind of documents when it comes to beauty. Of course, Plato and Aristotle did not define the branch of philosophy as aesthetics, but that came much later from a thinker I don't remember. But it is rooted in the very humbling beginnings. So I'll go ahead and get my notes up here. So when we were looking at some of our preliminary objectives, now that we've kind of given the brief epistemological and psychological outline in relation to a beatific vision, i.e., a pure vision, you know, before we lecture on the philosophers, I think it would still be beneficial to collate on the words beauty, aesthetics, and art. These terms are they've been abused, they've been particularized, secularized, and compartmentalized from their original intentions and etymologies. And and so we must kind of delve into them. We must redefine them before moving any further. So I'll try to give like the root definitions, or at least in part the historical origins of these words, so that we have kind of a philological understanding. We must talk about beauty first, beauty before we talk about art. Beauty comes from the Latin bellus, which means beautiful or fine. and the Old French, Beaut, Bellas, Bellas, Beaut, Beaute. And also the Greek term kalos or kalos, just two L, either one or two L's, Kallos or Kals. Now, in the Western usages, Pythagoras said that the golden ratio, which was perfection, wholeness, and truth in mathematics, was kalos. Okay, so that kind of gives you the Greek form, and then some of the later renditions in which this particular idea of beauty, has kind of fled or came into itself and grown into. So beauty, it's not nearly as misused or cropped or as meaningless as is the word art, but it may perhaps still be somewhat misunderstood. And so I took Webster's fourth edition New World College Dictionary, and it actually gives 5 definitions. I'm going to kind of cut some of these down and quote from it. So, 1. The quality attributed to whatever pleases or satisfies the senses or the mind, as by line, color, form, texture, proportion, rhythmic motion, tone, etc., or by behavior, attitude, etc. So that's the first definition. Much broader. 2. A thing having this quality. 3. Good looks. 4. A very good-looking woman. Little sexist in this day and age. 5. Any very attractive feature, unquote. So you will notice as this lecture progresses, take these definitions of beauty and the ones that I gave you, they're progressively more and more particular, and they become less general, with the exception of the 5th definition. They were even getting more specific on the genders of beauty, meaning the female is more beautiful. And there actually is some reason for that. It's just rooted in the visual appearance of our biologies. So we look at beautiful models, for instance, of women in art because we have so many examples through art history and sculpture and paintings, etc. And why is it always women, one might ask? Well, the answer is usually that women's bodies contain it's a more internal, like all of their parts are internal under the curves. So there's more of a mysterious quality that makes us seek out the beauty visually. And so, in contrast with the bodies of men, everything is external, it's viable, and nothing is, everything's exposed, nothing's left to the imagination. The imaginative powers, they must play a great role in a really good work of visual art. And this is because, kind of harking back to lecture 1, we wish to use in our judgments and discernments and poetical detections when we are seeking a beautiful image. We don't want the whole story, in other words. So art is rather sexual, at least in ancient terms, if not somewhat still in modern terms in a different way, but it's more explicitly sexual. We wish to not seduce a beautiful figure we are looking at, but rather we'd rather be seduced by the work of art itself. So in more abstract terms, this proceeds from like human sexuality. It's somewhat into landscapes, but then it starts to dissipate when we get to non-objective art. And that is because there's this obsession to kind of break away from this determined desire, and it's to desire something that is different or to desire something that is not, that something that doesn't even exist. It's completely human created, and it's maybe it's follows principles of design or craftsmanship or something, but it's completely removed from reality. Excuse me. So the first few definitions talk about fine art in a way when we're harking back to the definitions of beauty. Objects on walls or on pedestals. Well, our modern philosophers use that connotation more than the more general use. The last few definitions, more broad, and how the ancients used the term, and they used it in the more broad sense because they had no definitions of fine art. The Greeks did not have a definition of fine art. Okay, they used this more general sense in any number of artistic disciplines to stir up the spirit, and that was the poets did that, and they did this through music. See, and we don't use those words the same way today, and I'll give you some quotes later in the Plato lecture. But so if I have two lists here, one is it's how we approach beauty. So there's the traditional approach and there's the contemporary approach. Under the traditional approach, beauty is seen as more objective, relational, absolutist, and universal. But in the contemporary sense, it's more of a subjective thing or value. It's marketed, it's relative, not relational or absolute, but relative. And it is a lot more particular. And then there's also and we see this in Plato and especially in the early medieval period, there's this kind of philosophical idea of beauty as being pure. It's all about perfection. It's more orderly, it's consistent, and it's whole. Whereas secularism, kind of treats it not as much like innate beauty, but beauty is something that's more separate from and de-emphasized from everything else. So it's more arbitrary, momentary, fanciful, luxury. It's more of a luxury, sorry. And it's usually only of a monetary value, if any value. And so therefore it's also non-essential. So I have a graph here, and it's going to be way too difficult to. I don't really have a way to put this in the video yet. Maybe eventually I can, but so okay. So I have three tiers when we're looking at the concept of beauty. So concept in action, and actuous subdivision. So the concept being beauty branches off in action into what's practical application and what's intellectual fascination. Okay, so beauty in a action of practicality kind of subdivides into what is nature, so that's like landforms, molecular structure, the human body, procreation, and also in a practical sense what is man-made. So dealing specifically with craftsmanship or skills. Now in beauty, the concept is in an intellectual fascination, in that type of form of action. It is subdivided into what is idealism and conscientiousness. It's an exploration through art, which is essentially what we're doing, but to understand all the other facets of what beauty is. to truly examine, the schema of our universal functions and creating in our own astonishment of beauty, we would have to survey history thoroughly to begin to understand. Perhaps another course will make this possible. We will have to cover the philosopher's ideas on beauty, art, and aesthetics to later understand these concepts. My idea is just to give you enough of a taste of what these differences are so that you're able to move forward and even do your own research or maybe give me suggestions of what I could further address. So, Adler's differentiations of beauty, he talked about beauty in a lot of different sources, are usually one, what is enjoyable, and two, what is revering. So, what's enjoyable is kind of what's ornamental, it's pleasing, it's pretty to look at, and revering, which is more like something you can adore, something of adoration. It actually is valuable, it's worthy of worship. So I have an analogy here for that. If that is too difficult to understand what we've been talking about and all of these different ways I've been trying to talk about beauty. So for instance, let's say we have a movie, what I call a popcorn film, which is just a studio film, a large budget studio film, something kind of like Star Wars or Transformers. Okay, so it posits to entertain. It's there to be pleasing. It's to please upon being seen. But in contrast, look at a film that is thought provoking, like an indie film of some kind, something more like Vanilla Sky, or maybe something more like A Dangerous Mind or The Sunset Limited. Okay, and this indie film, it perhaps can pursue a moral quality or utility as well as being pleasing to look at. Maybe, and I do think there is a fine line between a film that's still, it's wanting to say something just about being human without being overtly political or propagandistic. So it's a fine line, but propaganda usually leads someone to be instrumental, to instrumentalize the audience to action. In this case, it's just to address this artist's values of what it is to be human and what they understand into their artwork. And I think that's asking for a conversation is different than holding a populace at gunpoint saying you have to do X, Y, and Z this way right now. So when we're looking at just a film that just entertains versus a film that is more beautifully crafted in its composition, in its writing, and its acting, and is actually of trying to achieve, maybe it's not successful, but trying to achieve some sort of higher meaning, it is of a higher value. Okay, and that is how we will look at this. I have a very strong external value system. I'm about value judgments, not so much critical judgments, or it's more difficult. You can't tell already, that I don't know why you're here, but just not to de-emphasize critical judgments, but it's different. That's not the first and foremost desire of what an aesthetician is trying to do. It's not what their primary objective usually is. So now, when we look at the word art, the ancient Greeks used the term art in its broadest, most general connotation, as I've said, and they did so consistently and better than any other civilization. And they did it with all of their terminology. So if we remember, for instance, that the term philosophy is the study of first principles, this will help us understand what we're about to endeavor in next. So every discipline, it's like the most fundamental aspects of what that is. In the book Art, the Arts, and the Great Ideas, philosopher Mortimer J. Adler, he reiterates essential Greek terms surrounding art. So I'll go ahead and quote him now. The speculative intellectual virtues are nous, N-O-U-S, and its understanding or insight. Episteme, which is the kind of knowledge that is called in Latin scientia. And Sophia, it's speculative wisdom, sometimes called philosophical wisdom. Okay, so I'll reiterate. Nous, episteme, which obviously, epistemology does come out of it, and Sophia. So two practical intellectual virtues are differentiated by two spheres of action. Praxis, it's the doing, moral or political conduct on the one hand, and poiesis, or making something, producing, or performing on the other. So in the sphere of praxis, the intellectual virtue is phronesis, which is prudence or practical wisdom. In the sphere poiesis, the intellectual virtue is techne. It's art, technique, skill, or know-how, unquote. Plato distinguished fine art from practical art, i.e. praxis versus poiesis, i.e. the doing versus the making, and poiesis, phronesis versus techne, or prudential wisdom versus skill or technical wisdom. And he did so in this way. Art was the skill and craftsmanship of producing. It's utilitarian in nature, and like the decorative vases of ancient Greece, poetry was the language that stirred the soul, and it would help produce what he called music, M-O-U-S-I-K-E, or music. In the symposium, Diotima is engaged in dialectic with Socrates and expressed, quote, poetry in many kinds of making. It is many kinds of making. For when anything passes from not being to being, this cause is always making, or poetry, so that in all the arts the process is making, and all craftsmen in these are makers, or poets, unquote. And Socrates in his reply states, quote, but yet they are not all called poets, they have other names, and one bit of this making has been taken, that concerning music and verse, and this is called by the name of the whole, for this only is called poetry, and those who have this bit of making are called poets, unquote. So, okay. I know that was a lot of language I threw at you, and I got a little stumbled. I'm sorry. My notes are a little small, and it's hard to read the quotations that are italicized, so I apologize for that. But there's all these different terms, even music, we just mean musical structure now. We don't mean the stirring of the soul. And poetry, we mean, something that has a particular structure that you read, and it's like, no, it's any sort of what we would call a fine artist today. So let's step back, and I'm gonna kind of quickly try to approach the practical art versus the what has later become more of this contemplative kind of art, or art of beauty, right? So I can ask you, the audience, what do you do well? You can say, mowing the yard, or making a sandwich, or solving mathematical equations. These would be skills or arts you have developed to where, if you're telling the truth, you have surpassed the adequate capability and have met the proficient or excelling ranges. That's what it means to do well. In our contemporary society, there is less emphasis put into making things than to be able to acquire something. The Industrial Revolution has made this possible, but it's altered. I'm not saying it's ruined, don't misunderstand me, but it's kind of altered the way in which Western culture used to run. So it's altered the importance of the what and the how. So have you ever noticed that, like an object of utilitarian means, i.e., a tool, such as something that's manufactured, it's a commercial item, even something like a rifle sold at Walmart, or a set of dishes, or like a hammer, or a garden ornament, or an axe, or something. It's not made as well as, a historical rifle or ornament or knife or axe or something found in a museum that's made by hand. The quality, it has went down, but it was faster to make it. It was, you did not have to actually make it yourself. It's made in what we call this kind of, it's made democratically, so it's made it affordable, commercial, and accessible. That's what I mean by democratic. So the more of the Deweyite kind of sense. So in modern terms, it's not a work of art, but simply and explicitly only a tool. And so the item, it still can require skills to use it, but the item is not one of a kind. Like if you go to Nelson Atkins and you're going through the artwork of Europe after the Renaissance, forget the room, but it's close to the El Greco Mary Magdalene painting, but it's centered in the room because it's an object in glass. It's these flintlock pistols, and it's made of ivory, and it's got all these intricate. It probably took years to make. The beauty in it, of course, it's a utilitarian item, right? But it's made at such a high skill. It is transcended just a tool into being an actual work of art, or how we see it that today. I mean, it has a historical context, but it kind of exceeds those limitations. So, you know, the item still can require, a skill to use it, but the item is not one of kind. The item may have a fancy patina or some sort of imitation gold or something out of brass or whatever, but since it's most likely not handmade, it is just not of a greater intrinsic value. So, in a general sense, really all humans are artists, at least in the most basic sense for utilitarian means. And examples of people, who do their craft well include, cooks, people who do woodworking, performing or acting, or or athletes. So they still have a skill and they're still trying to achieve something. So this is more like the way in which the ancients use this term. It's used in a way in which it's more universal. It's, there's an endeavor here to be completed, and that's easy for everybody to relate to. So modern would be more culturally centric to this type of sense of the term. A vase or a work of architecture, such as the Temple of Nike, a religious thing, it would overlap in this sense, but, maybe not a weapon of war or like a chariot or something per se. So we've changed things because we've become more we were of a classical liberal nature in the West, and it was only war just in retaliation to offense because you have a moral obligation to defend yourself. But it wasn't just conquest. That's part of the barbaric ancient world, which we're still fighting with in our own country to this very day. Forces are still at work to keep us in war for national interests over national principles. But it is what it is. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop this. So we got through beauty and some of art. I'll go ahead and finish discussing art and aesthetics at the beginning of the next lecture.